My name is Eleanor Hayes, and what I'm about to tell you may sound like the plot of some twisted crime novel, but it is my life. Imagine standing in front of your own coffin, listening to a pastor speak solemn words about your eternal rest, while your children weep crocodile tears beside a grave dug too quickly. A grave they prepared for you. That was me. I was the ghost at my own funeral, breathing, trembling, consumed by rage and grief, but very much alive. They thought they had silenced me forever. They thought the poison, the forged papers, and the shallow pit would erase me. But the moment I stepped into that cemetery and saw my children lowering the coffin, I swore the truth would burn brighter than any of their lies. Do you know the kind of chill that pierces your bones when betrayal comes not from strangers, but from the very children you nursed, fed, and prayed for? Do you know what it feels like to hear your neighbors whisper, "She was a good woman," while your sons quietly calculate the insurance payout they will pocket once you are gone? That is the kind of chill that doesn't fade. It lives inside you, it gnaws at you, and it forces you to fight back. I still remember the look on Charles's face when he saw me that day. His eyes widened, his lips parted, and for a moment he looked like a little boy again, caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Except this time the jar was my life, and the price of his theft was my blood. Henry, the younger one, wasn't even capable of shock. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared, and in that instant I knew he had already rehearsed what to say if I survived. That was the kind of cold-blooded calculation I never thought my own son could be capable of. The guests at the funeral gasped. Some crossed themselves. Others stumbled backward as if I were a phantom. But I wasn't a ghost. I was flesh and bone, scarred by betrayal, but fueled by a storm that no coffin could contain. As I stood there, feeling the mud damp beneath my shoes and the sky heavy with storm clouds, I asked myself, how did it come to this? How did 40 years of sacrifice, of sleepless nights spent rocking crying children, of meals skipped so they could eat, end with my sons plotting my death for a handful of money? I could hear the pastor's voice faltering, uncertain whether to continue the prayers. The wind whipped through the trees, scattering dead leaves across the graves. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from fury. I wanted to scream, to tear away the masks they wore in front of our neighbors, but I held my tongue. Timing was everything. One wrong word, one reckless move, and I would lose the only advantage I had left, the truth hidden inside me, the story I alone could tell. And so I ask you this, whoever you are, wherever you are listening, if your own flesh and blood plotted to bury you alive, would you forgive them, or would you rise from the grave to take back your dignity? Think carefully before you answer, because I have walked through that fire, and it leaves marks you can never erase. The beginning of this nightmare wasn't the funeral, it wasn't the coffin, it wasn't even the poison. It started months earlier, with whispers and paperwork, with greed dressed up as concern, with the small, almost invisible cracks that spread through the foundation of my family until the entire house collapsed. But at the time, I was blind. I thought a mother's love was strong enough to shield me. I was wrong. I remember the day I first suspected something was off. It was a rainy Tuesday, the kind of day when the sky hangs low and the air smells like wet earth. Charles came to visit, a rare occasion by then. He sat at the kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast as a boy, but he didn't look at me with warmth. He looked at the old wooden cabinets, the chipped plates, the fraying curtains, as if all of it were beneath him. "Mom," he said, "you and Dad deserve something better than this old house. You should think about selling." His smile was polite, but his eyes weren't. They were calculating, weighing, already subtracting me from the equation. At the time, I brushed it off. Children grow up. They change. They dream bigger than their parents ever could. But as weeks turned into months, the suggestions grew sharper, heavier, almost like commands. Henry echoed every word Charles said, like a shadow repeating its master. Then came the insurance papers, shoved under my nose with rehearsed lines about protecting the family and securing my future. Still, I refused to believe. I thought they were misguided, greedy maybe, but not monsters. That illusion shattered the night I tasted bitterness in my tea. It was faint, almost undetectable. But after 40 years of drinking the same evening brew, you know when something is wrong. I set the cup down and watched Henry watching me. His hand trembled just slightly, enough to betray his nerves. In that moment, something inside me cracked. I didn't confront them, not yet. I pretended to be the frail old woman they thought I was. I let them believe their poison worked. I let them forge the death certificate, arrange the funeral, and call the insurance company. I let them lower that coffin into the ground, empty except for a stranger's corpse they passed off as mine. I let them do all of it because I knew the day would come when I would rise, when I would stand before them, not as a victim, but as their reckoning. And here I am, standing in the rain, staring at the grave they dug for me, staring at the faces of my children. And I want you to know everything. Every whisper, every forged signature, every betrayal that turned me from a mother into their prey. You think you know what greed looks like, but until you've seen it in your child's eyes, you don't. You think you know what betrayal feels like, but until you've tasted it in the last sip of your evening tea, you don't. I will take you back with me to the beginning of this descent. I will show you the signs I ignored, the warnings I silenced, the love I gave that was twisted into a weapon against me. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you will understand why I say this with every ounce of conviction I have left. I may have been buried once, but I will never be buried again. The funeral was only the beginning. The real storm started long before the coffin touched the ground. I promised I would take you back to the beginning, to the first cracks in the walls of my family, the subtle signs of betrayal I ignored because I didn't want to believe my children were capable of such darkness. And it all started with papers, innocent-looking sheets of paper that carried the weight of death hidden between their lines. It was a Thursday morning when Charles came to see me. The sky outside was a pale gray, the kind of sky that makes you want to light a candle and brew something warm. I was in the kitchen folding the laundry when I heard his car pull into the driveway. He rarely visited alone, and when he did, it wasn't to sit and talk about old memories. It was always business, always money. "Mom," he began as he placed his leather briefcase on the kitchen table. He smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a son visiting his mother. It was the smile of a banker pitching a deal. "I've been thinking a lot about your future. You're 70 now, and you've worked so hard. Don't you think it's time to make sure everything is secure?" I frowned, wiping my hands on a towel. "Secure? What do you mean, Charles?" He opened the briefcase with deliberate calm, like a magician about to reveal his trick. Out came a stack of documents neatly clipped together. He slid them across the table toward me, his eyes shining with a strange intensity. "It's just paperwork, Mom, an update to your insurance. Nothing complicated. It would mean if something ever happened to you, Henry and I would have the resources to take care of things. You wouldn't have to worry." The words sounded sweet, but something sour lingered beneath them. I picked up the papers and skimmed the bold letters at the top. Life insurance policy. Coverage. $250,000. I nearly dropped the pages. $250,000? My voice trembled. "Charles, I never asked for this. Why would I need such a thing?" He leaned closer, his voice low, persuasive. "Because, Mom, accidents happen. We want to make sure you're safe, that you're protected. It's all for you." For me. Those two words stung. The policy didn't list my needs, my safety, or my comfort. It listed my sons as the beneficiaries. Every cent of that fortune would go directly to them. I tried to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just precaution, but in my heart, a small spark of suspicion flickered for the first time. Later that night, I mentioned it to my neighbor Doris while we sat on the porch, sipping weak tea. She frowned, her wrinkled hands tightening around the cup. "Eleanor, you be careful. Big insurance like that, it's a blessing if you've got good people around you, but it can be a curse if you don't." She didn't say more, but the way her eyes darkened stayed with me long after she left. I should have listened, but mothers don't want to believe their children are plotting against them. Mothers cling to hope, even when the evidence cuts like glass. Weeks passed, and the whispers grew louder. Henry came by with a forced smile, hugging me tighter than usual. He asked strange questions: what time I usually went to bed, whether I locked the doors, how much medicine I took. "Just curious," he said when I asked why. But there was something about the way his eyes darted to the cabinet where I kept my prescriptions that made my stomach twist. The first time I truly felt the ground shift beneath my feet was when I noticed my checkbook missing. I keep it in the same drawer of the old oak desk, the one my husband built decades ago. It had never been out of place. That morning, the drawer was slightly ajar, and the checkbook was gone. Panic surged through me. I searched everywhere, under cushions, in closets, between stacks of old letters, but it was nowhere. Hours later, Charles called, his voice unusually cheerful. "Don't worry, Mom. I handled a few things for you. You needed some bills paid, right?" I froze, the phone slick in my hand. "Bills? What bills? I never asked you to pay anything." He chuckled softly, too softly. "It's fine, Mom. You don't have to worry about the details. Just rest. Let us handle the complicated stuff." But it wasn't fine. He had signed checks in my name, checks I never authorized. The signature on the stubs looked like mine, but wobbled, as if traced by an unsteady hand. That night, I sat at the kitchen table staring at those stubs, realizing that the son I had once cradled in my arms had forged my handwriting to steal from me. The spark of suspicion grew into a flame. Still, I told myself maybe it was desperation. Maybe the boys were struggling and too proud to admit it. Maybe they thought they were helping. Mothers always find excuses, don't they? We paint over the cracks in the wall and pretend the house isn't crumbling. The final straw of that first round came one Sunday evening. We had always gathered for dinner on Sundays, a ritual that kept us tethered even as life pulled us apart. That night, Charles and Henry arrived together, their wives trailing behind them. We sat around the table, the smell of roast chicken filling the air. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old warmth until Charles lifted his glass and said, "Mom, we've been talking. It's time to think seriously about the future, about selling the house." I dropped my fork, the clatter echoing in the silence. "Selling the house? This is our home. This is where your father and I built our lives. Why would I sell it?" Henry exchanged a quick glance with his brother, then leaned forward. "Because, Mom, it's too much for you now. Too much work, too many repairs. You could move somewhere smaller, somewhere easier, and the money from selling could help with expenses." Expenses. That word hung heavy in the air, souring the taste of everything on the table. I looked around, expecting someone to defend me, but their wives stared at their plates, silent. My sons watched me like hunters waiting for their prey to tire. "I am not selling this house," I said firmly, my voice shaking but clear. Charles smiled that banker's smile again, the one that never reached his eyes. "We'll see, Mom. We just want what's best for you." That night, after they left, I walked through the empty rooms, touching the walls, the worn banister, the photographs lined along the mantel. This house was not just wood and nails, it was my life. And yet, in the eyes of my children, it had become nothing more than currency, something to be liquidated the moment I faltered. The betrayal had begun, though I didn't yet realize just how deep it ran. If the insurance papers and the talk of selling the house were the first cracks in the wall, what came next was the widening of those cracks until daylight poured through, showing me that the foundation of my family had already been hollowed out. Secrets never stay buried for long, not when greed is pushing them to the surface. It was Doris, my neighbor and friend for more than 30 years, who first gave me a glimpse of the storm I was standing in without knowing it. One evening, she knocked on my door, her gray hair damp from the drizzle outside, her eyes carrying that mix of worry and hesitation that told me she had news she wasn't sure I was ready to hear. "Eleanor," she said softly, once I had poured her a cup of tea, "I don't want to meddle, but I overheard something at the bank this afternoon. I went to deposit my pension, and I saw Charles there. He was speaking to one of the clerks about inheritance procedures. He was asking how long it usually takes for insurance money to be released after someone passes, and whether beneficiaries can access funds before a death certificate is officially processed." I sat frozen, my hands wrapped around the teacup, the steam rising between us like the smoke of a gun freshly fired. "Inheritance," I whispered, "but I'm still alive." Doris reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "That's exactly why I'm telling you. It didn't sound like the curiosity of a man planning for the distant future. It sounded urgent, like he was counting days." My stomach turned. I wanted to believe she had misheard, that Charles had been asking for a client, or for some unrelated reason, but deep down, I knew. This was no mistake. The confirmation came days later from an even more reliable source. Mr. Caldwell, our family lawyer, a man who had drawn up our wills decades ago, called me unexpectedly. His voice was polite but uneasy. "Mrs. Hayes, I hope you don't mind my reaching out. I thought you should know that Henry came by my office last week. He inquired whether it would be possible to update your will on your behalf, since he said you were having trouble reading documents these days. He even brought a draft for me to look at, already filled with details. It left the house, the shop, and most of your savings entirely to him and Charles. Nothing to you, nothing even held in trust for your care." The room spun around me. "He what?" I asked. Gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "I didn't sign anything, of course," Caldwell continued firmly. "I told him any changes would have to be done with you present. He wasn't pleased. I just thought you should know." I thanked him, my voice shaking, and when I hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the old family photographs on the wall. In one, Charles and Henry were grinning in matching Christmas sweaters, their arms wrapped around each other, their father kneeling behind them, beaming with pride. That photo had once been a symbol of joy. Now it felt like a cruel joke, mocking me with the reminder of the boys I thought I had raised. The betrayal was no longer hidden. It was marching toward me with open steps. And then came Jasmine, my daughter-in-law, Charles's wife. I had never fully trusted her. From the first day she walked into my home, her high heels clicking against the wooden floors, her eyes scanning every corner as if she were cataloging the furniture, the cracks in the ceiling, the view from the balcony. She had a smile that stopped at her lips and never reached her eyes. One afternoon, I returned home from the market earlier than expected. The bags of groceries weighed heavy in my hands as I pushed the front door open. Inside, the air was still, except for the faint hum of the copy machine I kept in the study for sewing patterns and receipts. My heart lurched. I hadn't turned it on that day. I stepped quietly down the hallway, the floor creaking under my feet. There, in the study, stood Jasmine, her back to me, feeding page after page of my property deeds and bank statements into the machine. She jumped when she saw me, the color draining from her face. "Oh, Eleanor, you startled me. I was just helping Charles with some paperwork. He asked me to pick up a few documents for refinancing." I stared at her, my chest rising and falling as if I had run miles. "Without my permission?" My voice was ice. She forced a laugh, gathering the papers in a hurry. You know how forgetful you can be sometimes. We just wanted to make things easier for you. Forgetful. That word sliced through me. It wasn't just an insult, it was part of their plan, the narrative they were weaving to paint me as incompetent, senile, someone unfit to make her own decisions. That way, when the time came, no one would question why my house had been sold, why my accounts had been drained, why my will had been rewritten. I wanted to throw her out that very moment, but I held back. I needed to know more. I needed to gather proof. So I said nothing, just watched as she smoothed her dress and walked past me with a too bright smile. But inside me, the flame had grown into a fire. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, remembering the early years when our family was whole, when betrayal was a word that belonged to other people's stories. I remembered Sunday mornings when Ernest would take the boys fishing by the river, their laughter carrying on the breeze. I remembered Christmas mornings when we had barely enough money for gifts, but Ernest would carve small wooden toys by hand, and the boys' eyes would light up with pure joy. Where had those children gone? When had their laughter turned into the sharp edge of greed? The contrast was unbearable. In my memories, the house was filled with warmth, with the smell of Ernest's pipe tobacco and the sound of children's voices. In the present, it was filled with silence, broken only by the scratching of pens on forged documents and the whisper of schemes spoken behind closed doors. It was Doris's warning, Caldwell's call, Jasmine's trespass, and my own memories colliding together that finally forced me to see the truth. My sons were not just drifting away from me. They were circling like wolves, calculating when to strike, and they weren't circling alone. They had allies. I realized then that I was standing on a battlefield I hadn't even recognized as such. Every smile from Charles, every polite word from Henry, every strained visit from Jasmine was a move in a game I didn't even know I was playing. And in their minds, the game could only end one way, with me gone and them standing over the spoils of my life. The first round had been about hints and suspicions. This second round was about revelations and widening cracks. I could no longer pretend not to see. The betrayal wasn't in the distance anymore. It was at my door, copying my papers, rewriting my will, calculating my death. And I, blind in my love, had almost let them succeed. If round 2 was the widening of the cracks, round 3 was when the whole ceiling began to collapse over me. That was when the pressure intensified, when my sons stopped hiding their impatience and began to push me toward the grave they had already dug in their minds. It started on what was supposed to be a celebration, my 70th birthday. I woke up that morning to silence. No phone calls, no visits, no flowers on the doorstep. I told myself not to be disappointed. Children grow busy, lives get complicated, and maybe they would come by in the evening. I put on my old lavender dress anyway. The one Ernest used to say made my eyes look like spring violets, and I waited. By 5 o'clock, the sun was dipping low, and I had almost resigned myself to spending the evening alone when I heard the sound of cars outside. Headlights swept across the windows, and then the front door burst open with Charles's booming voice. "Surprise! Happy birthday, Mom!" Behind him came Henry, and behind Henry came Jasmine, carrying a cake box too large for her delicate hands. The house filled with noise, laughter that sounded rehearsed, voices too loud to be genuine. They placed balloons in the corners, set the cake on the table, and insisted I sit in the armchair like a queen on her throne. For a moment, I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe they had remembered, that they cared, that maybe the shadows of suspicion clouding my mind were nothing more than paranoia. But then Charles poured me a glass of wine, pressing it into my hand with a smile that was just a little too eager. "Drink, Mom. It's a special bottle. We saved it just for tonight." I lifted the glass, but before it touched my lips, a bitter scent reached my nose, subtle but unmistakable. I had smelled it before, weeks earlier in the strange tea Henry had offered me. My heart thudded. I smiled faintly, swirling the wine as if admiring its color, and then set it down on the side table. "I'll drink later," I said softly. Charles's eyes flickered. Henry's jaw tightened. Jasmine laughed too quickly, slicing the cake with exaggerated cheer. But I saw the glance my sons exchanged, the silent question. Why didn't she drink? Dinner followed. They had brought roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, my favorites. But each dish tasted off, the seasoning too heavy, the wine vinegar too sharp, as if masking something. I moved food around my plate, chewing little, swallowing even less. "Mom, you're not eating," Henry said, watching me too closely. "I'm old," I replied with a thin smile. "I eat slowly." They tried to cajole me, tried to fill my plate again and again, but I held firm. All the while, I felt the air thick with unspoken tension, as if every bite I didn't take made their frustration grow. When the cake was served, I excused myself. "I need a moment," I said, walking toward the bedroom with slow, careful steps. I closed the door, left the light off, and sat on the bed in the dark, listening. At first, there was only the clinking of forks and the murmur of voices. Then Charles's voice, low and sharp. "She didn't drink. Did you see that?" "She knows something," Henry hissed back. "It doesn't matter. She's weak. She'll break soon. We just need to keep the pressure. The papers are almost ready. Once the insurance is processed, we can—" His voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. My hands clenched in my lap. My own children speaking in my living room as if I were already gone, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a mother to be loved. I wanted to burst out, to scream at them, to throw their cake in their faces and demand they look me in the eye when plotting my death. But I stayed silent. Silence was my only weapon. Silence meant I could gather more proof. Silence meant I could survive. Later, when they left, I walked through the empty house and felt the weight of loneliness settle on my shoulders heavier than ever before. It wasn't just that my children had betrayed me. It was that I could tell no one. The next day, I confided in Doris, my loyal neighbor, my oldest friend. Her eyes widened with horror as I told her what I had overheard. But then she shook her head slowly, pity softening her features. "Eleanor, you've been under so much stress. Sometimes grief and age make us imagine things. I'm sure your boys meant well." Her words cut deeper than the betrayal itself. If Doris didn't believe me, who would? Who would take seriously the claims of a 70-year-old widow that her own children were poisoning her? I tried the police once, walking into the station with trembling hands, but as soon as I opened my mouth, I saw the doubt in the officer's eyes. He nodded politely, took notes, but his expression said it all. Here was another lonely old woman spinning tales. The isolation grew like a second poison, slower than methanol but just as deadly. At church, I caught whispers when I passed. "She's been talking strange lately." At the market, the clerk smiled too sweetly, as if humoring a child. Even the doctor, when I mentioned fatigue and dizziness, raised an eyebrow and suggested maybe my memory was slipping. They were already painting me as fragile, unreliable, delusional, exactly as my sons wanted. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. White hair unruly, eyes rimmed with red, lips pressed tight to keep from trembling. I touched the glass, whispering, "Am I crazy? Or are they?" And then I heard Ernest's voice in my memory, steady and warm as it had been in life. "Trust yourself, Eleanor. You've always known the truth." It steadied me. It gave me the strength to endure. But the endurance came at a cost. The pressure grew. My sons visited more often, their words sharper, their smiles thinner. They brought real estate brochures, nursing home pamphlets, new insurance policies. They hovered like vultures circling a carcass not yet cold. One night, Henry leaned across the table, his voice like a blade. "Mom, you can't keep living in the past. Dad is gone. It's time to let go." I looked at him, at the boy I had once kissed goodnight, and I said softly, "Yes, your father is gone, but I'm not. And until I am, this house, this life, belongs to me." His face darkened, shadows flickering across his eyes. And for a moment I saw not my son, but a stranger who wanted me gone. That was round 3. The pressure, the isolation, the cruel charade of a birthday that was really a rehearsal for my death. They thought I was weakening. They thought I was breaking. But I was listening, and I was planning. If round 3 was the pressure that nearly crushed me, round 4 was the collapse itself. The moment when I tasted what it meant to be erased while still breathing. It began with a sickness that was no accident. One morning, not long after the cursed birthday dinner, I woke to a burning in my chest and a dizziness that made the room spin. My hands trembled as I gripped the nightstand, struggling to stand. The world tilted, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. My throat felt raw, my vision blurred, and for a moment I thought perhaps age had finally caught me, that my body was simply giving out. But then I remembered the bitter wine, the heavy seasoning in the chicken, the way Henry's eyes had studied me across the table. This was not age. This was design. I collapsed on the living room floor. The last thing I saw before darkness took me was the framed wedding photo of Ernest and me, his smile frozen in time, his hand resting on mine as if to remind me I was not alone. When I woke, the air smelled of disinfectant and rubber gloves. I was in a hospital room, wires taped to my chest, machines beeping softly. My son stood at the foot of the bed. Charles was speaking to a doctor, his voice too calm, too rehearsed. Henry was flipping through papers, not even glancing at me. "She's unstable," the doctor was saying. "Multiple organ stress. Could be complications of age." Charles nodded gravely. "We understand. We just want what's best for her." I tried to speak, to tell them I was still here, but my throat was dry, my lips cracked. Only a whisper escaped. Henry leaned down then, his face inches from mine, his smile as cold as ice. "Don't worry, Mom. We'll take care of everything." The words chilled me more than the IV dripping into my arm. Hours passed in a blur. Nurses moved in and out. My son sat whispering in the corner. I heard fragments. Insurance, death certificate, release of funds. Each word hammered nails into the coffin they were already building. The following day, I felt stronger. I tried to sit up, but Charles was suddenly at my side, pressing gently but firmly on my shoulder. "Don't strain yourself. Rest. The doctors say it might be better not to fight it." Not to fight it. Those words rang like a bell tolling my own death. By evening, a priest came in, not at my request. He carried a small Bible, his eyes full of solemn pity. "I've been asked to prepare you," he said softly. "Prepare me? For what? For death?" Who had decided I was leaving this world when I still felt the heat of anger pulsing through my veins? Later that night, through the thin walls of the hospital room, I overheard Charles speaking with the doctor. His voice was steady, practical. "Is there a way to sign the paperwork early? We'd like to avoid delays. My mother wouldn't want unnecessary suffering." Unnecessary suffering. That was what they called my life. The next morning, I was told I had slipped into cardiac distress during the night. I had no memory of it. The doctor explained in a rehearsed monotone that I had been declared legally unresponsive. And then, my heart still beating, my mind still screaming, I was transferred not to intensive care, but to the morgue's holding ward. I was not dead, but the papers said I was. They placed me on a cold metal slab, a sheet pulled up to my chin. I heard voices fading in the hallway, my son's, signing forms, arranging the funeral, the slam of a file cabinet, the squeak of a pen scratching my false death into permanence. Time dissolved into fear. The silence of the morgue pressed against my ears. I tried to move, to scream, but my body felt heavy, drugged. Minutes passed like hours. My mind swam between memory and reality, between Ernest's voice telling me to fight and the knowledge that my own children had paid for my grave. I don't know how long I lay there. At some point, a hand touched mine. Not Charles, not Henry. A nurse with kind eyes bent close. She whispered, "You're not gone. I can feel your pulse. Hold on." Her name was Marjorie. She had been working the night shift for 20 years, and she knew the difference between life and death. She risked her job, maybe even her safety, to hide me in a storage room until the drugs began to fade. "Your sons have already filed the certificate," she whispered. "They think you're gone. Don't let them know you're awake. Wait." And so I waited. My body weak, my heart raging, I listened to the sound of my own children forging my death. I imagined neighbors already preparing casseroles, the pastor polishing his eulogy, insurance agents calculating payouts. My life, reduced to paperwork and signatures, erased by the hands I once guided across alphabet worksheets when they were children. When I was strong enough to sit, Marjorie smuggled me out through a side entrance, wrapping me in a blanket like a fragile thing. "Stay hidden," she urged. "They can't know yet. If you confront them now, they'll find another way to silence you. Wait for the right moment." The right moment came days later, at the funeral itself, but before that I returned to my house. My home had been stripped. The curtains pulled down, the cabinets emptied, photographs missing from their frames. On the kitchen table sat a folder marked Estate Planning. Inside were copies of my forged will, lists of assets, estimates of insurance payouts. My sons had not even waited for the dirt to cover my coffin. They had already begun dividing the spoils. I sank into Ernest's old chair, the scent of his tobacco still faint in the cushion, and I felt tears slide down my cheeks. But they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of fury. Fury that burned hotter than grief, stronger than fear. Fury that told me I was not done yet. They had buried me on paper. They had signed away my life. They had dressed a corpse in my clothes and called it me. But I was alive, and I was coming back. They thought I was finished. They had their signatures, their paperwork, their coffin. They thought I was resting on a cold slab with my story sealed forever. But life has a way of clinging to those who still have unfinished battles, and I had one left to fight. Marjorie, the night nurse who had pulled me from the brink, became my unexpected ally. She was the kind of woman who had seen too much to be easily shocked, too many lonely deaths, too many quiet tragedies behind hospital curtains. But she told me mine was different. "I've never seen children work so hard to erase their mother," she whispered, her eyes wet with something between pity and fury. "I won't let them get away with it." For days, I hid in her small apartment above the pharmacy. She brought me tea, warm blankets, and the strength to gather myself. I was weak, my hands still trembling from whatever they had slipped into my food, but my mind had never been sharper. Each hour I lay awake, replaying every moment of the last months, the fragments of conversations I had overheard, the forged papers, the suspicious glances. All the pieces began to fit together into a single undeniable truth. My sons had not just betrayed me, they had tried to murder me. And yet, for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange kind of calm, because now I had proof in my survival, proof in the false death certificate they had filed, proof in the very fact that they would be standing at a grave the next day, weeping over a body that wasn't mine. The plan came to me in the quiet hours of the night, when the city was asleep, and only the distant hum of cars reminded me the world was still turning. I would not stay hidden. I would not let Marjorie smuggle me away to another town, as she had suggested. "Eleanor, you could start over somewhere new," she pleaded. You could leave them to their greed and live the rest of your days in peace. But peace built on silence is no peace at all. If I ran, they would still profit. They would still spend the insurance money, still tell the world their mother had died quietly in her sleep, still wipe away the truth of my life with a few signatures. No, I told her, my voice steadier than I expected. I'm not going to hide. I'm going back. If they wanted me dead, then they can face me alive. The morning of the funeral arrived gray and heavy, the clouds low, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Marjorie pressed a folded envelope into my hand before I left her apartment. "This is the copy of your death certificate," she said. "Signed by the doctor, notarized, filed. You show this, and no one can deny what they did." I slipped it into my purse, alongside the forged will I had found on my kitchen table and the list of assets my sons had so eagerly divided. Each piece of paper was a weapon, sharper than any knife. I dressed with care, choosing the dark purple dress Ernest had loved, the one I had worn at our 40th anniversary. My hair was pinned back simply, my shoes polished. If I was going to walk into my own funeral, I would do it with dignity. As I approached the cemetery, I felt my heart hammering in my chest, but not from fear. It was anticipation, the kind of anticipation you feel before stepping onto a stage, before the curtain rises, before the truth bursts into the light. I stood at the edge of the gathering, hidden beneath the shadow of an old oak tree. From there, I could see them all. Charles with his solemn mask of grief, Henry shifting impatiently, Jasmine whispering behind her veil, neighbors murmuring softly. The pastor's voice carried over the crowd. "We are gathered here to lay to rest our beloved Eleanor Hayes." Beloved. Well, the word almost made me laugh. I waited, my hands trembling inside my gloves, until the moment came when the coffin was lowered, the ropes creaking, the earth yawning open to receive what they thought was me. The first handful of dirt hit the lid with a hollow thud. That was my cue. I stepped forward. The crowd gasped as I emerged from the shadows, each step measured, each breath heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. Heads turned, a murmur spread like fire through dry grass. The pastor faltered mid-prayer, his Bible lowering slowly as his eyes widened. Charles turned, his face draining of color. For one flicker of a second, he looked like a child caught lying. Then his mask cracked. "Mom?" he whispered, as if speaking to a ghost. Henry's reaction was sharper. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes darting to Charles, to the coffin, to the crowd. I could see his mind spinning, already searching for a lie that might save him. But there was no lie strong enough to bury the truth now. I stopped beside the grave, my eyes fixed on the coffin. My voice, when it came, was clear, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That is not me in there. I am alive, and I know what my sons have done." The silence that followed was electric. Every face turned to me, shock, disbelief, horror mingling in their eyes. Some crossed themselves, others gasped aloud. Jasmine dropped her veil and stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth. I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope Marjorie had given me. I held it high for all to see. "This is the death certificate they filed, signed and notarized, declaring me dead while I was still breathing. They forged my will. They emptied my house. They tried to erase me." A ripple of outrage spread through the mourners. Neighbors who had known me for decades stared at Charles and Henry with new eyes, eyes that no longer saw grieving sons but predators exposed in the daylight. In that moment, I was no longer the frail old woman they had tried to bury. I was their reckoning. And yet, I wasn't finished, because standing there at the edge of the grave, I realized the battle was only beginning. Documents could be denied, words could be twisted, lies could still be spun. I would need more proof, more allies, more fire to burn away their masks completely. But the turning point had arrived. I was no longer waiting for death. I was no longer the victim lying on a slab. I was alive, I was standing, and I was ready. The storm was coming. And this time, I would not run from it. I would walk straight into it and let it tear the truth wide open. The funeral had erupted into whispers and gasps, but I wasn't done. Proof and outrage could stir the crowd, yes, but the true confrontation had to happen in the shadows, where masks could fall and truth could slice without witnesses. That night, after the mourners had scattered and the pastor had closed his Bible with trembling hands, I returned home. The house was dim, the air heavy with the smell of dust and betrayal. I thought I was alone, until I heard the creak of a floorboard in the hallway. Charles stepped into the kitchen, his face pale, his tie loosened, his eyes wild. "Mom," he breathed, "what are you doing? You weren't supposed to—" I cut him off with a glare. "I wasn't supposed to live? Is that what you mean?" He froze. His mouth opened, then shut. His hands twitched at his sides. "You don't understand," he muttered. "You were suffering. You were sick. We were just trying to make things easier." I took a step closer, my voice low, sharp as glass. "Easier for who, Charles? For me? Or for the man who forged my signature, emptied my account, and filed my death while my heart was still beating?" His breath hitched. His eyes darted to the window as if calculating escape, but I pressed forward. "Do you remember when you were 10? How your father worked 2 jobs just to buy you that bicycle? Do you remember the way he looked at you, the pride in his eyes? That man's blood runs in your veins, and this is what you chose to become, a thief, a murderer." Charles slammed his fist against the counter, the sound echoing through the kitchen. "We didn't mean for it to go that far," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Henry said it was just a way to get ahead, to pay off debts. You were old, Mom. You wouldn't even notice. You wouldn't even suffer." "Don't you dare!" I snapped, my voice cutting through his excuses. "Don't you dare tell me what I would or wouldn't feel. You poisoned me in my own home. You signed away my life, and you had the nerve to stand over a coffin and cry crocodile tears. And you think that makes you less of a monster?" For a moment, his bravado cracked. His shoulders sagged, his hands trembled. He looked at me the way he had when he was a child caught lying about broken glass, desperate to be forgiven. "Mom," he whispered, "please, you don't have to go to the police. We can fix this. We can undo it." I leaned in close, my face inches from his, my voice a whisper of fire. "The only thing you can't undo is the truth. And the truth is that you tried to bury me alive. I will never forget that, and I will never forgive it." He stumbled back, his eyes wide, his breath shallow. For the first time, I saw fear, not of exposure, not of prison, but of me. "Tomorrow," I said, stepping aside, my hand pointing toward the door, "the whole town will know what you've done, and when they look at you, Charles, they won't see a son. They'll see the man who tried to kill his own mother for money. Get out." He hesitated, his lips trembling as if searching for one last excuse, one last plea, but none came. With a final shuddering breath, he turned and left. The sound of the door slamming echoing like a gunshot in the empty house. I sank into Ernest's old chair, my body weak but my spirit burning. The private confrontation was done. The son who had once been my pride was now nothing but a shadow of greed and cowardice. And yet, I knew this was only the first battle. The real war would be fought in the open, under the eyes of the world, where lies could no longer hide. Climax 1 had ended with fear in my son's eyes. Climax 2 would end with judgment in everyone else's. The private storm with Charles had shaken the walls of my house, but I knew the true battle had to unfold under the weight of daylight, before eyes that could not be shut, before mouths that would carry the truth into every corner of the town. Secrets survive in shadows, but in light they burn. The next morning, I returned to the cemetery. The grave they had dug for me still yawned open, the coffin half covered in dirt, the flowers already beginning to wilt. Neighbors lingered, whispering about the impossible sight they had seen the day before, me walking among them, alive. The news had already spread, but whispers were not enough. I needed fire. I stood before them all, my hands steady despite the tremor of age. "Yesterday," I began, my voice carrying over the rows of gravestones, "you all watched them bury a coffin and call it me. You heard the prayers, you saw the tears, and you believed the lies. But I am here, I am alive, and I will show you exactly what they have done." Gasps rose from the crowd. Some clutched their rosaries, others crossed their arms, waiting for proof. I pulled the envelope from my purse and held up the death certificate. "This," I said, "is the paper that declared me dead, filed while I still had a pulse. Signed by a doctor who took their money, notarized by their lies. This is not just betrayal, this is attempted murder." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Impossible!" Another whispered, "God help us." I opened the folder further, pulling out the forged will. "And this," I continued, "is the will they drafted in my name. Every cent, every brick of my house, every memory Ernest and I built, handed directly to them, not to me, not to the truth, to their greed." The air grew heavy. Faces turned toward Charles and Henry, who stood stiff at the edge of the crowd. Charles's face was pale, his lips pressed tight. Henry, though, tried to fight. He stepped forward, his voice loud, desperate. "She's confused. She's old. She doesn't know what she's saying." The words might have carried weight if not for the folder I held in my hands. I unfolded the last sheet, a record Marjorie had risked her career to give me. A hospital report dated the day they declared me gone. "This says I was admitted with symptoms of poisoning," I said, my voice cold. "Not old age, not natural illness, poisoning. And who stood beside my bed whispering to the doctor about insurance and signatures? Who arranged for a priest to come before my heart had even stopped? These two men, my own sons." The silence that followed was thunderous. Even the wind seemed to die, the leaves frozen on their branches. Then the first voice rang out, from Doris, my neighbor, who stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. "I heard him," she cried, pointing at Charles. "At the bank, asking about inheritance before his mother was even gone. I thought I misheard, but I didn't." Others joined in. A nurse from the hospital, face pale with guilt, admitted, "They paid the doctor to file it quickly. I saw the envelope. I said nothing. Forgive me." The crowd erupted. Shouts, gasps, curses filled the cemetery. People surged forward, surrounding my sons, their masks stripped by the light. Charles tried to speak, but his voice cracked. We were desperate. Debts. We didn't mean—" "You didn't mean?" I roared, my voice stronger than I knew I possessed. "You didn't mean to poison me in my own home? You didn't mean to forge my name, to sell my house, to bury me alive? You didn't mean to let your children grow up knowing their father murdered his own mother for money?" The words struck like stones. Even Jasmine, standing behind them, shrank back, her veil trembling in her hands. "I told you this would happen," she hissed at Charles, loud enough for those nearest to hear. "I told you she would fight back." The betrayal spread like wildfire. The very allies they had counted on, wives, neighbors, even the pastor, turned against them. And then came the twist. For in that chaos, it was not me who delivered the final blow, but Henry. Perhaps fear broke him, or guilt, or the realization that the tide had turned beyond repair. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head, his voice cracking. "It was Charles. He planned it. He bought the poison. He forged the papers. He told me to go along or he'd ruin me. I never wanted this. I swear it was him." The crowd gasped. All eyes swung to Charles, who stood frozen, betrayed by the very brother who had echoed his words since childhood. His lips trembled, but no words came. For the first time, the mask of confidence shattered, and I saw not a mastermind, but a desperate man cornered by his own blood. I stepped closer, my eyes boring into both of them. You blame each other now like children caught stealing candy, but this is not candy. This is life. This is death. And this is justice. The pastor raised his hand, his voice shaking with fury. Enough! This is a house of God, and you have defiled it with lies. May the law do what it must. And the law was already there. The police, alerted by the hospital nurse and the whispers that had spread overnight, stepped forward through the crowd. Handcuffs gleamed in the weak sunlight. "Charles Hayes, Henry Hayes," the officer intoned, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder." The crowd erupted in cheers, gasps, and prayers. Some wept, some clapped, others simply stared in disbelief as my sons were led away, their heads bowed, their wrists bound. I stood tall, though my knees trembled beneath my dress. I looked at the coffin, half buried, and whispered to Ernest's memory, "We are free." The confrontation was over. The truth had burned away the lies. The funeral they had staged for me had become their own trial, their own undoing. And yet, as I walked away from the grave, I knew this was not the end. Betrayal leaves scars, even when justice is served. But for the first time in months, I felt the air fill my lungs not with poison, but with hope. The handcuffs clicked shut, and my sons were led away. But the echoes of their betrayal did not end in that cemetery. A truth like this does not stay contained. It spills, it spreads, it ignites. What had begun as my private nightmare became a public fire that consumed every corner of our community. Neighbors who had once nodded politely now approached me with trembling hands, their faces pale with shock. Doris, my oldest friend, wept openly, clutching me as if to anchor herself. "Eleanor," she sobbed, "I should have believed you. I should have trusted what you told me. I thought you were just grieving. I didn't see. Forgive me." Her tears washed some of the loneliness from my heart. For weeks I had been dismissed, called confused, fragile, paranoid. Now every eye that met mine carried not doubt, but sorrow, outrage, and respect. The pastor, who had stood frozen with his Bible the day before, came to me with fire in his voice. "I have buried many souls, Mrs. Hayes, but never have I seen such wickedness paraded before God. This town will not forget. Your sons will be remembered not as heirs, but as betrayers." His words rang like judgment carved in stone. Marjorie, the nurse who had risked everything, stepped out from the crowd, her uniform still smelling faintly of disinfectant. She spoke loud enough for all to hear. "She is alive because I found the truth no one else wanted to see. Her sons tried to silence her, but she fought. And we must all fight to make sure the guilty cannot hide behind family ties or polite lies." Her testimony carried weight. The whispers turned into declarations. Men who had worked with Ernest muttered about how the boys had always been restless, greedy. Women shook their heads, saying they had noticed Jasmine's cold eyes, her disdain for the modest home. One by one, voices rose, weaving a chorus of condemnation. What had once been my lonely battle was now a collective cry. The betrayal was no longer just mine. It was a wound in the community, an offense against every neighbor who had shared meals with us, borrowed tools from Ernest, watched my sons grow. Even those who had doubted me before, bank clerks, the young doctor who had hesitated to question the false report, now stepped forward. One clerk admitted, "Charles asked me how fast a death certificate could be processed. I thought it was morbid curiosity. I never guessed." Another man added, "Henry came to the bar bragging about money coming soon. We thought it was a business deal. We were wrong." The fire spread beyond the cemetery. By evening, the local paper had already called. By nightfall, the story was on the front page. "Mother declared dead. Returns at own funeral. Sons arrested for fraud and attempted murder. Headlines screamed betrayal. Reporters circled, microphones thrust toward me. I'd never spoken to cameras before, but now I did, my voice steady. Blood alone does not make a family. Love does. Loyalty does. And betrayal must never be excused, not even when it comes from your own children. Those words burned their way across the county, across the state. Letters arrived in my mailbox within days, strangers writing to say they, too, had been betrayed by those they trusted most, wives who had discovered hidden wills, parents abandoned in nursing homes, children disinherited for money. My story had cracked open something larger than myself. Even in the courtroom weeks later, the fire still burned. Journalists packed the benches, neighbors filled the aisles. The same community that once whispered that I was confused now stood as witnesses, their voices loud and unshakable. Doris testified about the bank. Caldwell, the lawyer, produced the forged will. Marjorie laid out the hospital records. Piece by piece, the truth was cemented before the law. And in that moment, I realized the power of witnesses. Alone, I was a widow, fighting shadows. With them, I was a storm no one could silence. Their words gave weight to mine. Their outrage gave strength to my trembling hands. Their fire made sure the truth could not be buried again. What began as my son's attempt to erase me had instead erased them. From honor, from community, from memory. And the town that once pitied me now stood at my side, united not just in anger, but in the conviction that family betrayal must not be hidden, must not be excused, must not be allowed to poison our lives. The fire had spread, and in its flames the lies had burned away. Justice moves slowly, but when it finally struck, it landed like thunder. My sons, my own blood, were no longer men in fine suits or voices of authority. They were prisoners in orange, wrists bound, faces hollow. The courtroom that once echoed with their arrogance now echoed with verdicts that stripped them of every mask. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The community that had once admired them as successful men from humble beginnings now spit their names like curses. Neighbors who had borrowed Ernest's tools, who had shared our dinners, now crossed the street rather than greet them. In the market, whispers trailed behind. Those are the Hayes boys, the ones who tried to bury their own mother alive. No amount of money could buy back the dignity they had squandered. The law was merciless. Fraud, forgery, attempted murder. Each charge carried years, stacked like bricks on their shoulders. Their lawyer tried to plead desperation, debts, weakness. But the judge looked at them and said, "Desperation does not excuse betrayal. Debt does not excuse murder. And greed will never excuse trying to erase the very woman who gave you life." The gavel fell. Decades in prison. No parole. I walked out of that courthouse lighter than I had in years. Not happy. Happiness was a word that no longer fit my mouth. But free. Free of their schemes. Free of their shadows. Free of the poison that had lingered in my veins. But freedom came with a price. I could not walk through my home without seeing the fingerprints of their betrayal. The kitchen, where Henry had leaned close to study whether I would drink the tea. The hallway where Charles had carried forged papers in his briefcase. Even the porch, once filled with Ernest's laughter, felt haunted by their lies. My home was mine again, yes, but it was no longer innocent. The town carried scars, too. People who had once envied my son's success now whispered about how greed can rot the soul. Parents held their children closer. Wives questioned the papers their husbands asked them to sign. Trust, once easy, became something brittle. And yet something else grew in the ashes, a strange kind of solidarity. The very neighbors who had doubted me now brought meals, flowers, quiet company. Doris, racked with guilt, visited daily, insisting, "You will never drink tea alone again." Marjorie, the nurse who had risked her job, became more than a savior. She became a friend, sitting with me on long nights when the silence threatened to crush me. Even strangers wrote letters. A woman from 3 towns over confessed that her son had stolen from her. But after hearing my story, she had found the courage to report him. A widower said my defiance reminded him that dignity does not end with age. My pain had become their warning, my survival their torch. As for my sons, the aftermath was merciless. In prison, stripped of suits and titles, they faced not admiration but contempt. Other inmates sneered, calling them cowards for turning on their own mother. The news spread beyond our town. Magazines, radio shows, even television anchors recited their crimes. 2 sons tried to profit from their mother's death and failed. They had wanted to be remembered for success. Instead, they were remembered for betrayal. Jasmine, the daughter-in-law who had copied my deeds, packed her things and vanished. Some said she fled to the city. Others said she changed her name. To me, she was already a ghost, erased not by death, but by her own cowardice. And what of me? I stood among the ruins, battered but unbroken. For weeks, I walked to the cemetery every morning, carrying fresh flowers to Ernest's grave. On his headstone, I whispered, "We won, my love." They tried to bury me, but I stood. And they paid. Each word was a balm to my wounds, a reminder that though I had lost sons, I had not lost myself. The aftermath was not clean. It never is. Night still brought dreams of coffins, of bitter tea, of forged signatures. Morning still brought whispers of neighbors repeating my story, but each day I felt the weight lift a little more. Each day I remembered that survival itself was victory. They had wanted me gone, erased, forgotten. Instead, I was standing, breathing, speaking, and they, the betrayers, were the ones erased from freedom, from respect, from love. The aftermath was justice, and justice, though late, was enough to let me live again. The trial ended, the sentences were handed down, and the headlines faded from the newspapers. But my story did not end in that courtroom. Stories like mine never really end. They linger, they echo, they shape the lives that come after. I am 71 now. My hair is white as snow, my hands lined with years. But when I look in the mirror, I no longer see the woman who lay on a morgue slab, waiting to be erased. I see a survivor. I see a mother who refused to be buried alive. I see a wife who kept her husband's dignity alive long after he was gone. My home, though scarred by memories, has become my sanctuary again. I painted the walls a soft yellow, the color Ernest always loved, and filled the rooms with flowers from the garden that grows where his workshop once stood. Sunflowers reaching for the light, roses blooming even after storms, lilies bending but never breaking. Each blossom is a reminder. I was meant to stand, not to fall. Every Sunday, I carry a bouquet to Ernest's grave. I kneel by the stone and tell him about my week, the letters from strangers, the visits from neighbors, the laughter of children who still run through our yard. I tell him I am not alone, that his love still shelters me. And sometimes, when the wind stirs the trees above, I swear I feel him answer. The world has called me many names since that day at the cemetery. Survivor, fighter, hero. Some call me cruel, too, for sending my own children to prison. But I do not live for their labels. I live for the truth. And the truth is this: family is not defined by blood. Blood betrayed me. Family is defined by loyalty, by love, by the hands that lift you when you fall instead of pushing you into the grave. That truth became larger than me. After the trial, I took the money I could never spend, the insurance payout stained with betrayal, and I gave it away. I created a small foundation in Ernest's name to help others betrayed by their own families, women abandoned in nursing homes, men cheated out of their homes by greedy children, elders tricked into signing away their lives, We offer lawyers, counselors, investigators, tools I wish I had before my nightmare began. And in helping them, I healed myself. Each time I sat across from a woman trembling with fear, telling me her children were pressuring her to sell her house, I reached across the table and said, "I believe you." Those 3 words denied to me for so long became the gift I could give others. Henry and Charles remain behind bars. I do not visit them. I do not read their letters. Perhaps there are apologies scrawled on those pages. Perhaps there are excuses. But forgiveness is not a door I can open. They made their choice the moment they signed my death into ink. My grief for the sons I once had is real, but it is grief for ghosts. The men they became are strangers, and strangers have no claim on my heart. Do I miss them? I miss the boys they were, the laughter on Christmas morning, the muddy shoes by the door after fishing trips, the way they once looked at me with love rather than calculation. But those boys are gone, and clinging to their memory would only chain me to pain. So I let them go. Instead, I embrace the family I have chosen. Doris, who stands at my side with fierce loyalty. Marjorie, who risked everything to save me, who now visits every week with stories from the hospital. The neighbors who once doubted me, but now bring me pies and flowers, reminding me that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt in unexpected ways. In quiet moments on the porch, with the sun dipping low and the smell of coffee in the air, I ask myself the question that still lingers. Was it worth it? Was the pain, the betrayal, the loneliness worth standing up, worth fighting back? And my answer, every time, is yes. Because silence would have killed me long before poison did. Silence would have let lies triumph, and silence would have buried Ernest's memory under the weight of their greed. Now, when children in town pass by my garden, I call them over and hand them a sunflower. I tell them, "Stand tall. No matter who tries to bend you, stand tall." They don't always understand, but someday they will. And so my story ends not with despair, but with defiance. I was buried and I rose. I was betrayed and I spoke. I was alone and I found family again, not in blood but in loyalty. To you, listening to my story now, I ask this: what would you do if the people you loved most tried to erase you? Would you let their lies define your end, or would you stand, trembling but unbroken, and make the truth heard? I chose to fight. I chose to speak. I chose to live. And because of that choice, Ernest can rest in peace, knowing his wife did not let their love be poisoned by greed. This is my confession, my warning, and my testament. Betrayal may cut deep, but dignity endures deeper. They tried to bury me, but they forgot one thing. I was a seed, and seeds grow back stronger. So if my words reach you, if you feel the echo of my fight in your own bones, remember this: silence buries, but truth resurrects. Do not let fear or blood or betrayal keep you quiet. Stand, speak, live. And now I leave you with one final question, the one that carried me through every dark night. If they tried to bury you alive, would you stay silent or would you rise?